Hi, welcome to another video, and in this one I want to address the contentious subject of the physics engine and tyre model within Project Cars 3, particularly in comparison to its predecessor, Project Cars 2. Now, the main reason I wanted to do this is there's a degree of debate. Now, the vast majority of people fall into the camp that the physics and overall handling model within Project Cars 3 is, for want of a better phrase, dumbed down in comparison to Project Cars 2. But there are a small number of people who are absolutely adamant that everything's been improved and it's far more realistic now. And I wanted to explore this. I'm going to be perfectly honest, I fall into the former category. I do honestly believe that it is dumbed down, again, for want of a better word, in comparison to Project Cars 2, but I wanted to really look at this a little more openly, do some subjective back-to-back testing across a range of vehicles, and put my thoughts around it on video for you guys to really comment on and put your own thoughts against it. But I also wanted to put in something that was a little more objective as well, and I'll come on onto that towards the end of the video. So I took a number of cars out, ones that I am reasonably familiar with from Project Cars 2. Some of them challenging, some of them not particularly challenging in their approach, and start looking for the differences between the two titles that I can feel across them, really express what those are, and start thinking about some of the reasons why this occurs. Now, the first thing I want to get out of the way is I don't actually personally dislike Project Cars 3. So long as you take it for what it is, which is not, in my view, a continuation of the mainstream numbered Project Cars releases. It's more, so I mentioned this on my review, I mentioned this on my initial look at Project Cars 3, it's closer to a spin-off series that is a more approachable version of the Project Cars series. It's certainly still got that Project Cars physics engine underneath it, but you're not getting direct access to it, certainly not as direct access as you did in PC1 and PC2. So what about the cars I gave a go in? Well, first of all, an old standby of mine that I've played around with a lot, which is the Toyota GT86. Now, I use the GT86 as a reference in an awful lot of titles, and the reason why I do this is A, it tends to be in an awful lot of titles, so it's a good one from that point of view, and B, I've driven a fair few GT86s, so I've got a reasonably good understanding of what they feel like and what they drive like. And the GT86 is quite a nice car because it's predictable enough, particularly at lower speeds, for you to be able to know what's going to happen with it. And the main thing there is, as you turn in, you're going to get understeer on it. It's a road car, it's road biased, you should get understeer. The basic physics of how road cars are set up dictate that understeer is going to be your initial response, but you should, as long as once you get into that understeer, just momentarily pause on the throttle, lift it ever so slightly before then reapplying the throttle in a fairly gradual but progressive, quickly progressive manner, and the back end will step out a little bit. So basically it's that classic front engined rear wheel drive, understeer, pause, accelerate, and basically get the back end to step out. And Project Cars 2 does that. It's there for it. Now, I can't tell you whether it's 100% perfect. We'd need to dyno all sorts of things up to be able to tell that. But does it behave roughly how it should do? Absolutely. But when it comes to Project Cars 3, you basically don't get that understeer phase. It's kind of neutral, then you just apply the throttle and you don't have that understeer that you have to pause and get through. It just goes straight into power oversteer, and it's ridiculously easy to catch every single time to a large degree. It doesn't matter how much opposite lock you apply. It seemingly wants to help you out with it, and I'll come back and talk about why I think that is a little bit later on. and yeah, you just catch it and away you go. Now, it's very similar in that regard when you look at the 66 Mustang Fastback. Again, in Project Cars, you get what you expect, particularly from a front-engine rear-wheel drive, one with a big lazy V8 and one that's very front-heavy as well, which without a shadow of a doubt the Mustang is. You should get that initial understeer, pause, push through it, and you get oversteer. And you get that in Project Cars 2. Again, in 3, that understeer is gone. You don't get that. You just get the ability, as you're coming out of a corner, apply throttle, back end steps out. It is like a checklist of dum dum dum, this is what's going to happen. And it's very predictable, it's very easy to catch, but it's missing an important transition phase, which should be happening in reality, which is that initial understeer that you have to... Now, with that initial understeer, if you don't pause or slightly let go of the steering lock to just re-establish a little bit of grip up front before you accelerate, so you get the grip back up front and accelerate and break the rears with the new grip at the front, you should just carry on into understeer, and you don't get that. Not with the GT86 and not with the Mustang either. So there's definitely something wrong there. Then I had a play around with the Porsche GT4 Cayman, so the GT4 version of the Cayman, a GT4 car that I absolutely love. Really, I've always liked it in Project Cars, like it in Assetto Corsa, and again, it's a typical mid-engined car in that its initial balance is once again understeer, which is relatively unusual for a track-biased car, although you can set them up however you want. But initial understeer, very predictable, very sure-footed. And this one's probably the closest between Project Cars 2 and Project Cars 3, but there's still some quite distinct differences there. Because, again, it doesn't have in 3 that vagueness around the front end that it should have. And it makes it, almost for want of a better word, too pointy. It rotates well enough, and it rotates well enough in Project Cars 2 as well. It rotates very nicely, but again, you should have that rather classic mid-engined initial wash to a slight amount of understeer that you can balance and push through and get the car to rotate nicely, and it just wants to rotate straight away. I then gave the Ferrari 355 Challenge Cup car a go. So an incredibly famous car, and one that I adored in Project Cars 2, because in Project Cars 2 this is a car that it behaves exactly as I've just mentioned, as a mid-engined car, but it feels really alive. It's just constantly talking to you. You know absolutely everything that it wants to do. You take that in Project Cars 3, and it's like everything it's doing is being filtered through a committee, and you're getting the edited highlights that narrow everything down. And that's really the only way I can describe it, because it doesn't feel like the same car. It doesn't feel even remotely close to being as alive in Project Cars 3 as the one in Project Cars 2 does. The one in Project Cars 2 is an absolute delight to drive. It really is. It's just the right amount of challenging, and you can tell what it's doing, and if something goes horribly wrong, you know exactly why it's gone horribly wrong, and it's because you've messed up in some way. In 3, you don't get any of that. It is like that layer of communication has just been ripped away, and you've just got this kind of like sanitized version of it, and it's just not enjoyable in the same way. And then the final car, which is the one that you've been watching this entire time, is our good old turbo Lotus F1 car. Now, the reason why I wanted to pick this is not because it's particularly a car I'm good at driving, in all honesty, because in every title that's done this car justice, it's one of those vehicles where you can get to about 8/10 in it and you're fine. It's not a problem at all. But pushing it past that and being able to consistently push it past that is an absolute challenge. And this thing was renowned as being an absolute beast in its day. You know, we're talking circa 1000 bhp here in an incredibly light chassis with suspension technology from a previous era or two ago, and turbo lag of monumental proportions. And that's the thing here, when that turbo comes on boost, being able to catch that and react to that sudden snap and making sure the car's straight, it should be challenging. It should be something that you are constantly thinking about and constantly aware of. And in Project Cars 2, that is exactly it. You have to be aware of what the car's doing. You have to be listening to what the car's telling you, and you have to be aware of what's going on with it. And again, we get this filter, this communication by committee almost coming through again. And for want of a better word, it takes an absolute beast of a car and to a large degree neuters it. This was my second run around the ring in this car, and I'm able to take liberties with it that quite frankly would see your ass handed to you in Project Cars 2. And in Project Cars 3, it just strikes me as, oh well, this is now a car that you can just jump into and drive. It's a little bit more challenging than the others, but it's not really that challenging. You can just jump in it and drive and you'll be absolutely fine. And that, sorry, I refuse to believe that's correct in this case. And I'm not getting into the, Sim should be difficult to drive bit here. This is a car that was difficult to drive. The people that drove it described it as a car that was difficult to drive. You know, this thing wasn't ever going to be easy to drive. 1000 brake horsepower in a car of its era was always going to be a challenge to drive on the limit. And it just doesn't feel that way in Project Cars 3. It really doesn't. Not in the same way. And don't get me wrong, Project Cars 2, it's not that it's so difficult it feels unfair. Again, when you lose it in Project Cars 2, you know it's because of something dumb you did, not some kind of inbuilt engineered trick it's playing on you. And that comes on to where I think some of the problems lie with regard to Project Cars 3, because, as I say, I do fundamentally believe that the building blocks underneath it are still the old Madness engine and possibly even a refined version of it. But it has a layer, an absolutely massive layer of aids and assists, not all of which I believe you can turn off, smothered all over it. And I also don't believe that makes a difference whether you're using a gamepad or a wheel. These are still here. I think input smoothing, which is basically where it's giving you a margin of error for, say, the amount of counter steer you apply or the amount of throttle you apply to correct for the power oversteer or something like this. I think it's got a massive amount of input smoothing built into it, and I think that's one of the main culprits with regard to this. Other things, the speed sensitivity, which is an important thing, but I think it's giving a really hefty helping hand, and everything that's going on with the physics engine feels like it's being filtered through this and the damping on the control input and a shed load of other things. That's just really making it quite difficult to do anything. And there's a couple of what are now objective tests that I've carried out that really do point to something going on here. And smothering a lot of what's going on in there. Now, the first one, and this is something I discovered on my first look at Project Cars 3 video, and I did it there with the Formula Rookie, and I've since repeated it with a massive number of vehicles, and I've done back-to-back testings against Project Cars 2 with regard to this. And this is basically using my H pattern shifter to drop from a high gear into first gear at a hefty speed to see what happens. Because being perfectly honest, in the vast majority of every car, if you do that, your engine speed and your vehicle road speed now are going to be completely mismatched, and it's going to lock up the driven axle without a shadow of a doubt. Now, how much effect locking that driven axle up has on the stability of the car is going to depend on the degree of difference between your road and your engine speed, the weight of the car, which axle's driven, etc., etc. But you should feel it, and in In a lot of cases, you're going to lose control of the vehicle, and in the more extreme cases, you should be ending up facing the wrong way because you've just locked up one end of the car without the other end being affected. So I actually gave this a go in the Lotus, and I think I was doing about 170 odd miles per hour, and dropped it from top down into first, and the sum result of that was the car slowed down. That's it. And that is so fundamentally wrong, it's beyond belief. It's a huge hole in the physics engine. Now, weirdly, if you're actually turning and on the brake slightly and you do this, you get a much more pronounced effect. So again, it seems like it's going through some kind of filtering before it's reacting. So there's definitely something going on there. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is also something that I've noticed in jumping backwards and forward from Project Cars 2 to Project Cars 3, and that's the braking time. The actual stopping distances seem just massively short. So what I did was I had a look around an autocar. I've always been good for this at 0 to 100 to 0 times. I actually found an interesting one which they did for their 120th anniversary, which was a 0 to 120 to 0 test. And the reason why I used this is because it had a Nissan GTR Nismo as one of the cars tested in it. Now, the particular Nismo that they were supplied by Nissan for the test did have a couple of Nismo options on it, including slightly stickier tyres than standard, and they, when they figured that, managed to get that to drop from 120 miles per hour to 0 in 5 seconds dead. So I put that through its paces in Project Cars 2 and Project Cars 3 just to see what would happen. Now, in Project Cars 2, I got it from 120, well, actually it was a shade over, it was about 121, 122 to 0 in 5.37 seconds, which is pretty much where I would expect it to be, particularly given that the real one in the autocar test had the slightly stickier rubber on it. So that, for me, that's Project Cars 2, thumbs up there, that's ballpark accurate there. I then ran it in Project Cars 3, and I got it to stop in 3.36 seconds. And then I noticed that I had ABS switched off. Now, I hadn't done any cadence braking here. I basically just stomped on the brake pedal. I stomped on the brake pedal from, and again, it was around about 122 miles per hour, and got it down to 0 in 3.36 seconds. So that is a second and a half quicker than reality, with reality running slightly stickier tyres, and with ABS switched off. Now, I should have locked, and that stopping distance should have been significantly greater than that. Interestingly, I did it with ABS on as well and got that figured in at around about 3.44 seconds. And that's still way faster than it should be in reality. You know, with the margin for error, I would have expected anywhere between around about 4.5 seconds up to 5.5 seconds would be roughly where I'd consider a margin of error on this and acceptable. To be a good second outside that at 3.5 seconds is just mind-blowing, particularly with ABS switched off, because it's almost as though even when you switch ABS off, it's still on. It's still doing something, because there's no way with just a foot to the floor braking experience from 120 miles per hour I should be able to stop that quickly. Should I be able to stop quicker in a non-ABS braking experience than with an ABS one? In theory, yes, but you're going to need to use cadence braking. You can't just hammer the brake pedal to the floor. So again, there is definitely something going on with regard to stopping distances here. And once again, if you're turning and you do this, you will get lockup in Project Cars 3. But in a straight braking, I didn't get lockup, and it almost felt through the vibrations in the wheel that ABS was kicking in again. So once again, it does seem as though there is something going on. There is a lot of filtering going on with regard to what's happening in the Madness engine in the background, and how that translates to your inputs, goes into the Madness engine, gets filtered, comes back out, affects how the car drives. And there is a whole suite of stuff, in my personal view, and I think both my subjective experience and the objective testing I did bears this out. There's a lot going on in there that arguably is odd. So my conclusion is, I really haven't changed my mind, which is the physics in Project Cars 3 is not a patch on the physics in Project Cars 2, even though weirdly what's going on underneath is exactly the same. And that's why it still looks good in replays a lot of the time, because the actual mechanism of what's going on is still there. It's still that same physics engine. It's just going through this committee of programs that are helping you out, and that's where the nuance gets lost, and that's where we start to see a few of these really quite odd but objectively wrong things going on with the engine. So there we go, that's me rambling on for a very long time about the physics engine in Project Cars 3 and in comparison to Project Cars 2. If you found this vaguely interesting, please do give it a like, and if you want to see more content like this, please do subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified when videos get uploaded. Thanks very much.